Hey there, it's Cass. So before we start today's video, I just want to give a quick apology. I am so sorry this video took so long to produce. It's a lot longer than most of my other videos, and it just seemed like the world did not want me to be able to record the audio for this one. For background, I ended up thinking that I might have COVID, which was not great. Thankfully, I didn't, but I did end up sick for almost a week and a half straight, and I completely lost my voice, and it was just not good. And then on top of that, my wire for my Blue Yeti microphone just seems to not be working anymore. And I decided to just try to fight through it and get the audio for the video recorded, and it took forever because of that. So thank you guys so much for being patient. I'm so sorry about the wait. Anyway, onto the substance of this video. I am so excited to show all of this to you. Today we are going to be getting into probably my favorite characters in my entire D&D campaign. They are the family of big bads that a lot of my campaign focuses around. This video is a big thank you for 100 subscribers, which is not a number that I ever thought I would hit this quickly. Seriously, thank you guys, that's absolutely amazing. You have no idea how much I appreciate all your support on my videos so far. Now, I do want to give a small trigger warning at the beginning of this video. The Safir family story is a very dark one. Obviously, they're the big bads in my D&D campaign, and they get a little macabre and they explore some dark themes. So with that said, if themes of domestic violence and abuse trigger you, I completely understand if you want to skip through this video. I find their story to be very interesting, and as someone who has dealt with abuse in my life myself, I find their story to actually be kind of cathartic with them as the villains, but I totally understand if it's not some of your guys' cup of tea. So just please keep that in mind when you're watching and stay safe. Anyway, let's jump into the video. Thank you guys so much for 100 subscribers, and here is the dark story of the Safir family. We open our scene on the gleaming white-walled city of Albane. The city has always been heralded as a force of the law. Crime here seems almost non-existent, thanks to their elite council of judges that act as a shining beacon of hope in an otherwise broken world. That is, until you look closer. It seems only fitting that we start this story at the beginning, with the sins of the father. Hiram Safir had always had his eyes set on one thing: power, the ability to rule for eternity, immortality. One day, his dark research into the subject had led him to forces beyond what he could have ever imagined. A dark force living in the space between spaces, hidden away from the many planes of the world, in the dark beyond the stars. A lich who had hidden away from the mortal realm when the gods resurged, found Hiram, and in the shadows they formed a pact. Hiram was to help him become something more. And in exchange, Hiram made a vow that would seal the fate of not only himself, but all of his future descendants. The Lich granted Hiram intense magical power, and a unique trait that would be passed down to all his family bound by their pact: immortality. Hiram was granted with a phylactery of his own, keeping his mortal life separated from his body, and when they eventually came, his wife and children would be bestowed with them as well. He moved forward, and so he began to seek out the pieces of his master's plan. For who else could know better what to do to undermine the very gods themselves than a being who existed outside the confines of life and death? We continue our dark story to a small abbey outside of the city of Albane, where we find our next addition to the Safir family. It was no secret that Maven Shield's daughter was a descendant of a being of a celestial nature. She had been blessed with unnatural beauty and bright rose-colored eyes. She had lived out her entire life at the Abbey, which at the time was one of the few places still actively worshipping the gods who had long since disappeared. Although she loved her faith and believed in it wholeheartedly, she wished for something more. She longed for a family of her own. This made it all too easy for Hiram to step in. He was a well-off politician at this point in our story, seen as noble by many of his peers and quite handsome. When he approached her for the first time, she was astounded at his knowledge on her faith. It was almost too easy for her to fall in love with him. He swept her off her feet with his honeyed words, and there was no hesitancy in her voice at all when he eventually asked for her hand. Maven was incredibly devoted as a wife, using her pull in the church to help Hiram gain the support of even more people in the city when he vied for the seat of head judge. Without her assistance, he may not have succeeded. She left the abbey, still continuing her work with the church alongside her new husband, uniting the church and judiciary courts as one. With their newfound political power over the city, and a devout follower of the gods by his side, Hiram could begin with the next phase of his plan. Maven remained in the dark to his ideas for the moment, enamored by his charm and the facade of his kindness. Slowly, Hiram began using his political power to make the unseemly members of society simply disappear, gathering souls for his master's purpose. But it wasn't enough. They would need many, many more souls for the Lich to consume to have the power they needed for their master plan. It would not be long before Hiram found another obstacle in his path as well. It would seem that while Maven certainly held celestial heritage, she was still only human, and did not have the abilities needed to become the vessel of power the Lich needed for his plan. It was here that Hiram hatched a darker plot. He went to his wife, bestowing her with gifts, and asked her, "My dear, why do we not start a family of our own?" This prospect delighted Maven, who had only ever wanted a family of her own. Over the course of many months, they tried and tried, but it seemed as though it was not the gods' plan for Maven to bear children. Over time, with their household barren, Maven began to notice a change in Hiram's demeanor. That mask of honeyed words began to fade away, revealing a gaunt face of bitter contempt. Maven feared the worst for her marriage, and for all of her hopes. All she had ever wanted was a family who loved her. So one night, she snuck away from her home in Albane, back to the abbey where she had been raised. Once safely inside, with only the moonlight to comfort her, she threw herself upon the steps of the altar within the church, begging the gods to hear her plea. But as she cried out, she was only met with the empty echoes of her own voice, ringing in her ears in the wide cathedral. She began to sob uncontrollably and screamed, "Have I not proved my devotion for everything that I have done, for all that I have preached? Please, I beg of all the gods, of anyone who will listen. I would do anything. I would do anything if it meant being able to have a family." And for just a moment, it seemed as though her prayers would go unanswered, as the halls around her rang out in a deafening silence. But then, there was a voice, or a cacophony of voices, whispers of a bygone age in the shadows of the dark. "I could help you if you wanted, but only if you give me something important to you in return. Tell me, what are you willing to lose to get what you want?" It was then Maven noticed a silver dagger appear at her feet, emblazoned with a red emblem in the shape of flames. She hesitated for a moment. For what sort of being would make such a request? But her desires took over her, and the thought of having a family would be worth losing even the most important things to her. The next morning, Hiram was called to the abbey for an emergency. There he found his wife being bandaged and cared for, her two perfect pink eyes carved out by a knife. Hiram was taken aback, especially when his bride, hearing his voice, smiled and assured him it would all be all right. The next few years for the Safir family were fruitful ones. Maven began to cover her face with a porcelain mask bought for her by her husband, both a reminder of her devotion and everything she had lost. But our story continues from here, from Hiram and Maven to their children, and Hiram's secret plan for them. Mordecai Safir is the firstborn child of Hiram and Maven. He grew tall and slender, with his mother's ashy hair running all the way down his back. He always took pride in his appearance. His personality, though, was that of his father, uncaring and cold. Hiram, at the time, was still unsure of how to begin testing the boy, to see if he had the abilities needed to become a vessel for his master. He knew an Aasimar would possess unique magic, and so he taught the boy what he knew of dark magical arts. It seemed, however, that Mordecai's skills would be more useful elsewhere. From a young age, Mordecai had always had a fascination with the macabre, the arts of sneaking, as one predator hunts their prey, of capturing a target and slowly, gruesomely extracting information from them. As a child, he would often bring home pets of a sort, although the animals never seemed to be alive by the time he was walking up to his family home's doorstep. It was here that Mordecai found his art, in shadows and savagery. Eventually, though, he had to move on from collecting pets, before the townspeople started noticing just how many missing animal posters were plastered around. Hiram was disappointed by this development, that Mordecai did not have the talents that he was looking for, but he could find use for Mordecai in their like-minded nature and Mordecai's obsession with the kill. After all, someone with such skills would be useful for gathering souls discreetly. A few years after Mordecai was born, Maven was blessed with 2 children, exactly a year apart. You would barely notice that they were different ages, as Astrid and Hugo Safir were joined at the hip since they were small. And for the longest time, Hugo insisted on dressing and cutting his hair the same way his elder sister did. At some points, you couldn't even tell them apart. Something always seemed to pull them together. They also shared their mother's rosy eyes and ashen hair, much like their older brother. Mordecai took little interest in the pair beyond tormenting them from time to time. That is, until their abilities started to develop. From a very young age, even completely independent from her father's teaching, Astrid always had a natural talent for magic, creating sparks that could flit around rooms in many bright colors to entertain her and her brother. This innate talent for magic sparked Hiram's interest in her immediately. Could his daughter finally be the key he had been looking for? Hiram began to train Astrid and Hugo vigorously in his dark affairs. Astrid, being a natural prodigy, picked up her magic quickly, almost effortlessly mastering new spells. And unlike Mordecai, who by this point had become a master at the clean and quiet act of killing, Hugo seemed to have no talents at all. He couldn't track or cast spells with any aptitude, and he was not particularly strong or quick. Hiram was always particularly harsh with him because of his failures. Hugo longed to be like his sister, who was surrounded with attention and given whatever she liked so long as she continued to excel. He loved her, but his resentment was growing. He wished he could be like her and do what she did. With what little talent he had, he started to form his own art, away from the eyes of his father. He began to copy his sister's face, her hair, eventually mastering copying even the hardest of forms with his magic. He could change his face freely to be like someone else's. But when he showed his father, it wasn't enough to impress him. After a severe punishment for failing another evocation lesson, Astrid took her brother out behind their house to play, seeing her brother in pain. They began to chase each other around an old, empty well as it started to rain. While they were running in circles, Hugo caught a glimpse of his face in a puddle, and his eyes darkened. It wasn't the face that he wished he saw. As his eyes rose to meet his sister's, he moved without thinking, shoving her. Astrid, not expecting her brother to lash out at her so suddenly, slipped backwards, her body tumbling down the well and letting out a scream so shrill her mother and father could hear it all the way from inside the house. It took Astrid many months to recover from her fall once her body had been collected from deep within the well, and from that point forward she would always walk with a cane, atop which a crystal shaped like a duodecahedron that matched her eyes was positioned. Hugo was more severely punished than ever for his actions, and from that point forward, he always seemed to be chasing Astrid, and she would push him away out of fear. Astrid had tried to excuse her brother's actions when speaking to her father about the event, as she didn't want him to be punished, but she truly felt betrayed by the person that she had trusted the most. After her injury, her mother became even more doting of her, stifling, never allowing her a moment's peace. So she began to slip away from home during the only time that no one was looking, while her family slept. And what a world she saw. As she traveled through the darkened streets of Albane during the night, she met many folk she would soon come to call her friends. The daughter of an innkeep who knew secret passageways through the city, and many thieves, vagabonds, and other night folk. When she was out in the open air, she was not Astrid Safir, daughter of the High Judge and prodigy magician. She was just a young woman, living and breathing and experiencing a life she never knew she could have. She experienced her first party with these people, her first drink, her first dance. One night, her excursions went just a little too long, and she didn't make it home by morning, having fallen head over heels dancing with a young man who shared her feelings of being trapped by destiny. Hiram was waiting for her when she arrived home. She had never felt the sting of his hand before, and vowed to herself to never feel it again after that day. She learned new ways of escaping home, even with the now barred bedroom windows and locked doors. It turns out all the magic her wretched father had taught her had proved to be useful in escaping him. Eventually, she sought to run away forever. Although she wasn't sure how she would hide from his ever-watchful eyes. He had people everywhere. Whenever she escaped, Hiram would send Hugo after her, as he somehow always had a knack for finding her specifically. He was still chasing his sister's shadow after all this time. The final member of the Safir family is perhaps the most odd. Penny Safir was born almost 10 whole years after Hugo and Astrid. With Hiram solidly focusing on Astrid's natural magical talents, he paid almost no mind to the small girl wistfully roaming through the house. Hugo was far too busy following in his older sister's shadow, and Maven and Mordecai had other duties to attend to. Because of this, Penny Safir grew up almost completely alone. This seemed to suit her, though. She learned to entertain herself, never squabbling in the middle children's affairs, or seeking to annoy her eldest brother. Mordecai in particular always shot her cold looks whenever they shared a room together. So, instead she would wander the grounds of the house, kicking stones and making imaginary friends. One day, one of them even sprung to life. A large, shadowy creature that she simply called Dog. Although, he wasn't really shaped like a dog at all. His long, clawed, human-like fingers with palms that could easily wrap all the way around her. Dog stood on 2 legs, nearly being taller than the first story of their house. But he was just Dog to her. They would often play together, sparring and rolling around in the dirt. Penny learned quickly not to drag mud into the house, so she would often have Dog scoot her through the upstairs bathroom window to wash herself off and avoid any unwanted attention. Somehow, to this day, it seems Penny is almost untouched by the dark nature of our story, always smiling to herself, content to be outside, away from the shadow of her family's past. And so concludes the dark story of the Safir family. Who knows what will come in the future, with Hiram's plans moving ever forward and ever downward into darkness. I really hope you guys enjoyed that story as much as I do. I know it tends to be a little dark, but I enjoy my villains having a dark and seedy underside. Since you made it to the end of the video, I have a little surprise for you. In the description of this video, there will be a couple of links at the bottom of the page. When I create characters, I really enjoy making playlists for them, so I'm going to be linking individual Spotify playlists for each of the Safir family members underneath this video. Some of them are longer than others. I think the most fleshed out ones I have are for Astrid and Hugo, but all of them have a lot of love and care put into them, so please give them a listen. And one other thing, because of some really amazing support that I got on the D&D Reddit, actually, I'm going to be releasing a homebrew module campaign specifically about the Safir family and focusing around Astrid and her dynamics within the family. If you guys would be interested in that, it's a very undead themed campaign, kind of dark, similar to something like Ravencroft or the Strahd campaign. I'm going to be working on that from now on, and I will put it in the description once it is ready. I will probably also make a quick announcement video when it comes out, so if you guys would like to, please subscribe to the channel and you can look out for update videos like that. I really hope you guys continue to enjoy my content. Thanks again for 100 subscribers, and I'll see you in the next video.